When the transatlantic showdown over Greenland kicked off last week, most people weren't optimistic about Europe's chances. Trump seemed set on acquiring the territory, and there was pretty widespread scepticism that the EU, which has spent the past year bending over backwards to appease Trump, would be able to muster sufficient resistance. However, after a surprisingly muscular European reaction, Trump apparently backed down. In the space of just a few hours, he walked back his threats of tariffs and invasion, and announced a so-called framework deal that looks basically identical to the deal the US already had with Denmark. So, in this video, we're going to have a look at Trump's U-turn, and why the experience of the past couple of days implies that appeasement is no longer the least bad option for the EU when it comes to dealing with Trump. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's start with a quick recap of what's happened in the past couple of days. This story really began over the weekend, when Trump, who had repeatedly refused to rule out using military force to annex Greenland, threatened an additional 10% tariff on 8 European countries who were apparently obstructing his efforts at annexation. This provoked fury in Europe, but Trump doubled down on Tuesday, insisting on Truth Social that Greenland is imperative for national and world security, and there can be no going back. Now, at this point, many people thought Europe would essentially fold and find some way to appease Trump. After all, this has basically been Europe's strategy for dealing with Trump since he returned to office. When Trump attacked NATO for not spending enough on defence, for instance, and cast doubt on whether the US would respond to the triggering of Article 5, NATO Secretary General responded by calling him Daddy, and implausibly committed to spend 5% of GDP on defence, more than double the existing 2% target. Similarly, instead of retaliating against Trump's tariff threats last year, the EU accepted an embarrassingly lopsided trade deal, which included not only a 15% flat tariff on most European exports to the US, but also a commitment to purchasing $750 billion worth of American energy products and investing a further $500 billion into the US. Unsurprisingly, this deal wasn't well received in Europe, but the EU argued that it was a necessary price to pay to keep Trump on side and avoid a sudden withdrawal of American military support for Ukraine. Anyway, you get the idea. When Trump restarted his overtures towards Greenland, there was a pretty widespread expectation that the EU would find some way to appease him, as they've done in the past. However, contrary to expectations, the European response was surprisingly muscular. The European Parliament formally suspended the ratification process for the EU-US trade deal. The European Commission dusted off the retaliatory tariffs it prepared during last year's trade negotiations, which would affect about 30% of all US exports to the EU, and French President Emmanuel Macron was apparently able to convince most other European leaders that, if Trump were to follow through with his new tariff threats, the EU should use its new anti-coercion instrument, sometimes dubbed the trade bazooka, to restrict American companies' access to the European market. A number of European countries even deployed troops to the territory, and Denmark promised to expand its military footprint on the territory in the future. The numbers involved were small, and the deployment was framed as a way of addressing Trump's stated concerns about Greenland security, rather than as an anti-American deterrence force. But it still didn't go down well with Trump, who took to Truth Social to warn that these countries were playing a very dangerous game. This set the stage for a transatlantic showdown in Davos, where Trump was due to give a speech on Wednesday in front of most of his European counterparts. However, in this much-anticipated speech, which ended up going on for more than an hour, Trump actually backed down and finally ruled out using force to annex the territory. Then, a few hours later, Trump also walked back both his tariff threats and his insistence on asserting American sovereignty over Greenland, announcing on Truth Social that he and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had agreed a framework deal for the territory, and that, as a result, Trump wouldn't be going ahead with his tariff threats. According to reports, this framework deal would basically mean that US bases in Greenland would be considered sovereign US territory, much like British bases in Cyprus. Trump and co will obviously try to spin this as a win, but to be honest, it's hard to see how this is functionally any different from the status quo. Denmark had already granted the US near unlimited freedom to deploy military assets to the territory, and signalled on multiple occasions that they're happy to go further. That any new bases will now technically be considered sovereign US territory might sound cool, but it doesn't make any practical difference. After all, it's not like Denmark and Greenland were policing what was happening on US military bases beforehand. So you get the idea. While MAGA might insist otherwise, it looks like Trump chickened out. A couple of days ago, he was insisting he needed sovereignty over Greenland and threatened tariffs and military action to get there. Now he's quietly walked back his talk of tariffs and military action and essentially accepted the status quo, albeit with some cosmetic changes. And this experience holds a valuable lesson for Europe. When it's united, it can win against Trump. In other words, Europe doesn't have to just accept appeasement as the least bad option. This is in part because Trump has less leverage over Europe than he once did. He's already imposed some pretty steep tariffs, and they haven't been as catastrophic for the European economy as many people expected. So European leaders are less intimidated by his trade threats. Similarly, Europe is less reliant on American support for Ukraine than it once was. The US stopped sending new weapon systems months ago. Europe is now financing Ukraine's war effort with joint debt, and France has mostly replaced the US when it comes to intelligence sharing. But it's mainly because Trump has very little tolerance for economic turmoil at the moment. Most Americans really disapprove of Trump's economy this time around, with his net approval rating on the issue sitting at about -15. Trump is clearly conscious of this political vulnerability, hence all his recent talk of affordability, and this has apparently made him more sensitive to economic risks. This would explain why Trump backed down when the EU started talking about retaliatory tariffs and trade bazookas, which triggered a sharp sell-off in the stock market, even if another transatlantic trade war would, overall, hurt Europe more than the US. Politically, Trump can't afford any more economic headwinds. Conversely, for most European leaders, picking a fight with Trump is good politics. Trump is incredibly unpopular in Europe, and many European incumbents have come under fire from opposition parties for not standing up to him. Now, you're probably looking to follow this story as it develops, but how are you supposed to keep track of which outlets online are actually trustworthy, and which are just fabricating a false narrative for you to follow? Well, that's where our sponsor this week, Ground News, comes in. That's because Ground News is a website and app that helps you make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. It can get increasingly overwhelming, with thousands of articles being thrown at us every day. But Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, helping you fully understand the story from start to finish. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each individual source. For instance, if we take this story on Trump's U-turn, we can see that there are 487 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the centre. We can even dive into how each side is reporting by using their bias comparison feature, showing us that the left is framing it as a diplomatic mess, while the right is praising Trump's blistering address confronting globalist elites. Our absolute favourite feature, though, is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your feed. So even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's good to know what's being left out of your bubble. You're probably used to being fed the news that the algorithm has decided is best for you, and breaking out of that spiral is harder than ever. Ground News will do that for you, freeing you from algorithmic restraints and letting you think freely again. So, if you want to start questioning the narrative instead of just consuming it, you can join Ground News today, and using our link will get you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.